Have you ever stood in front of an open refrigerator, not because you're hungry, but because you're empty? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a Monday morning, not because of work, but because it's the start of another diet? You've meticulously planned your meals, filled your fridge with green things, and sworn off sugar, only to find yourself, by Thursday night, surrounded by wrappers, filled with a shame so familiar it feels like an old, unwelcome friend. If this sounds like you are not broken. You are not lacking willpower. You are simply caught in a cycle that is designed to fail. Welcome to Health Storytellers, a space where we don't just talk about what to eat, but why we eat and how to heal our relationship with the very thing that is meant to sustain us. Today, we are going on a journey. It's my story, but it might just sound a lot like yours. It's a story of chasing perfection through 100 different diets and finding myself more lost than ever. It's the story of how I finally stepped off the treadmill of restriction and guilt and discovered a place of true peace and freedom with food. This is not a quick fix. It's not a 7-step program. It is a gentle, often messy, but profoundly beautiful unfolding. So, find a comfortable space. Perhaps pour yourself a cup of tea. No rules here. And join me as we explore how to stop the cycle, why dieting fails, and how I finally found food freedom. The memory is etched in my mind with the sharp clarity of a perfect, painful dream. It was a Tuesday, I think, or perhaps a Wednesday. The days had begun to blur into a monochrome haze of calorie counts and quiet desperation. But the moment itself remains vivid. I was standing in the stark, fluorescent glow of my kitchen, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. Before me, on the cold granite countertop, sat a single dry rice cake. It was my designated afternoon snack, a sad styrofoam-like disc that was supposed to stave off hunger until my meticulously portioned dinner of steamed chicken and broccoli. I remember picking it up, its lightness feeling like the weight of my entire existence in that moment. And as I took a bite, listening to the hollow crunch echo in the quiet, a single terrifying thought broke through the wall of my discipline. This is it. This is the rest of my life. But let me rewind. To understand how I ended up in that kitchen, in that silence, with that rice cake, we have to go back to the beginning. My story didn't start with deprivation. It started with promise. It always does. It was the spring of my senior year of college. The pressure was mounting, final exams, the terrifying abyss of post-graduation life, and a pervasive, low-grade anxiety about who I was supposed to become. I felt unmoored, a collection of potential without a clear direction. And then I found it. Or rather, I found her. She was a lifestyle blogger, all sun-kissed hair and radiant smiles, posing in a bikini on a tropical beach. Her transformation story was legendary. She had gone from soft and unhappy to toned and empowered in 12 short weeks, all thanks to a revolutionary new eating plan. Her tagline was a siren's call to my lost soul. Take control, transform your body, transform your life. I devoured her content. I read every testimonial, studied every before and after photo. These weren't just pictures, they were narratives of redemption. The before was a story of chaos, of indulgence, of a life lived passively. The after was a story of order, discipline, and victory. I wanted that victory. I craved that control. I believed with every fiber of my being that if I could just reshape my body, I could reshape my life. The chaos within would be mirrored by order without. So I began. I invested in the program, a binder full of recipes, shopping lists, and workout schedules. I bought the food scale, a sleek digital oracle that would tell me the truth of my portions. I cleared my pantry of the enemies, pasta, bread, sugar, anything processed. The act of purging felt like a purification. I was shedding my old, flawed self, making room for the new, disciplined me. The first grocery trip for the new plan felt like a sacred pilgrimage. My cart was a pristine landscape of green vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This was it, my true beginning. The first week was a symphony of virtue. I felt a clean, almost electric buzz from the lack of sugar and processed food. The hunger pangs were there, sure, but I wore them like a badge of honor. Each grumble from my stomach was not a plea for nourishment, but a proof of my willpower. I was winning a private, daily battle against my base instincts. My mind, once cluttered with anxieties about the future, was now laser-focused on the next meal, the next weigh-in. In a strange way, the rigidity was a relief. All the complex decisions of life were reduced to a simple binary, on plan or off plan. I was a soldier in the army of wellness, and I followed my orders with devout precision. But the body is an ancient, wise, and stubborn entity. It does not understand moral imperatives. It understands survival. And slowly, insidiously, the whispers of rebellion began. It started with the dreams. Vivid, technicolor dreams of crusty bread slathered in butter, of creamy gelato, of my grandmother's apple pie, warm and cinnamon-scented. I would wake up with a start, my heart pounding, the phantom taste of sweetness on my tongue. During the day, my focus began to fracture. In lectures, instead of listening to professors, I found myself mentally composing lists of every food I would eat when the program was over. I spent hours online, looking at pictures of food, a practice known as food porn, torturing myself with images of the very things I had sworn off. The clean, sharp clarity of the first few days was being replaced by a low, humming static of obsession. My social life, once a vibrant tapestry of shared meals and laughter, began to unravel. I declined invitations to restaurants, terrified of the menu. A friend's birthday party became a minefield of temptation and anxiety. I stood in a corner, nursing a glass of water, watching everyone else eat cake. The laughter sounded distant. The joy felt alien. I was on the outside looking in, separated by a pane of glass forged from my own rules. I told myself I was being strong, that they simply didn't understand my commitment. But in quieter moments, a lonely, hollow feeling would creep in. My world, which this diet was supposed to expand, had shrunk to the size of my kitchen scale. The breaking point, when it came, was both dramatic and utterly mundane. It was a Thursday night. I had stayed late at the library, working on a thesis that felt increasingly meaningless. I was tired, mentally drained, and cold. I came home to an empty apartment. The silence was deafening. I opened the refrigerator, and the sight of my pre-packaged Tupperware dinner of plain grilled chicken and cold-steamed broccoli filled me with a wave of pure, unadulterated despair. It was too much. The hunger, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the endless grinding pressure of being good. The flimsy dam of my willpower, strained for weeks, finally shattered. I don't remember making a conscious decision. It was as if a switch flipped. I moved in a fugue state. I drove to the grocery store, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I walked the aisles with a single-minded intensity, filling my cart not with food, but with contraband. A family-sized bag of potato chips, a box of sugary cereal, a jar of frosting, a loaf of white bread, a package of cookies. I bought things I didn't even particularly like, driven by a primal need for everything I had denied myself. Back in the kitchen, the scene was one of frantic, desperate consumption. I didn't sit down. I stood at the counter, tearing open packages, eating quickly, almost violently. Chips, cookies, a spoonful of frosting, a handful of cereal. It was a chaotic symphony of sugar, fat, and salt. There was no pleasure in it, only a frantic, urgent need to fill a void that felt bottomless. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The fog lifted. I was left standing amidst the wreckage, torn wrappers, crumpled bags, a counter dusted with crumbs. The sugar rush was already curdling into a sickening crash. And then came the shame. It washed over me, cold and heavy, pulling me to the floor. The internal monologue, cruel and familiar, began its harangue. You failure. You have no self-control. You blew it. All that work wasted. Look at what you've done. I felt disgusting. My stomach was painfully distended, my throat was dry, and my mind was shrouded in self-loathing. I made the promises I had made a dozen times before. The frantic vows to be better, to be stricter, to fast tomorrow, to double my workout. I would start again on Monday. Always on Monday. As I sat there on the cold kitchen floor, hugging my knees, my gaze fell upon the digital food scale, still sitting neatly on the counter. In the dim light, it no longer looked like a tool of transformation. It looked like the central component of a beautiful, intricate, and utterly inescapable cage. The bars were gilded with the promises of health and happiness, but I was a prisoner nonetheless. I had traded the chaos of life for the tyranny of the scale, and I was more lost than ever. The silence of the apartment was no longer just empty. It was accusing. And in that quiet, devastating moment, a new question, fragile but persistent, began to form in the ruins of my resolve. What if the problem isn't me? What if it's the cage? The weeks that followed my kitchen floor epiphany were characterized by a strange and unsettling stillness. The frantic energy of the diet binge cycle had been replaced by a void. I had declared a ceasefire in my war on food, but I had no idea how to live in the peace. The familiar structure of my eating plan was gone, and in its absence, I felt untethered and deeply anxious. The question I had whispered to myself, "What if it's the cage?" echoed in this new silence, a puzzle I felt compelled to solve. I knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical ache, that I would not, step back onto that hamster wheel of hope and despair. But if not there, then where was I to go? This time, my quest was different. I was not searching for a new set of rules. I was searching for understanding. I became an archaeologist of my own suffering, digging through the layers of diet culture dogma to find the bedrock truth beneath. I spent hours in the quiet corners of libraries, not with glossy fitness magazines, but with dense academic textbooks on physiology and psychology. I sought out the voices of those who had walked this path before me, therapists, researchers, and writers who spoke of a different way to inhabit a body. And piece by piece, the architecture of my failure was revealed to me not as a personal flaw, but as the predictable outcome of a system fundamentally at odds with human biology. The first and most liberating revelation was the demolition of the willpower myth. I had always believed my binges were a testament to a weak character, a pathetic lack of self-control. I learned that this was perhaps the most insidious lie diet culture tells us. Willpower is not a limitless moral virtue. It is a finite cognitive resource, like the battery on a phone. Every time I used it to resist a craving, to ignore my hunger, to navigate a social event without partaking, I was draining that battery. By the end of the day, after navigating stress, work, and life's demands, my willpower battery was often in the red. The late-night binge wasn't a moral failure. It was a simple, predictable system crash. More profoundly, I discovered that my body has its own ancient intelligence, a survival operating system that is utterly indifferent to my aesthetic aspirations. When I drastically restricted my calories, my body didn't hear, "I am trying to look good in a swimsuit." It heard, "Famine. Winter is coming." In response, it launched a sophisticated, multi-pronged survival campaign. My metabolism, the engine of my body, downshifted to conserve fuel. My thyroid hormone levels adjusted, and my non-essential energy expenditures were curtailed. I felt colder, more lethargic. My body was literally slowing down to keep me alive. Simultaneously, my neurochemistry became a saboteur. The production of ghrelin, the hunger hormone, skyrocketed, creating a persistent, gnawing sensation in my stomach that was designed to drive me to seek food. At the same time, levels of leptin, the hormone that signals fullness and satisfaction, dropped. My brain was being flooded with signals to eat, while the signals to stop were being muted. Furthermore, my brain's reward center became hypersensitized to the thought of high-calorie, forbidden foods. That obsessive, all-consuming craving for pizza or chocolate wasn't a sign of gluttony. It was a primal biological imperative. My body was trying to save me from what it perceived as starvation by making me fixate on the most energy-dense fuels available. When I finally gave in, the subsequent binge was not a failure of will. It was a biological correction, a desperate attempt to replenish fat stores and signal to my survival brain that the famine was over. This understanding of the restriction binge cycle was like being handed a map of a labyrinth I had been trapped in for years. I could now see the entire predictable loop with stunning clarity. Restriction, the diet, triggered a biological backlash, slowed metabolism, heightened hunger, food obsession. This created a state of intense psychological deprivation, the good versus bad food mindset, the feeling of being left out. The combination of biological and psychological pressure became unbearable, leading to the break, the binge. The binge, often involving forbidden foods eaten rapidly and mindlessly, was then followed by the inevitable neurochemical and emotional hangover, shame, guilt, physical discomfort. And this hangover, in a cruel, perfect circle, fueled the desire to return to the perceived safety and control of restriction, thus starting the cycle all over again. Seeing this not as my personal failing, but as a physiological inevitability, was like having a lifetime of shame lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't broken. I was a human being responding exactly as a human being is wired to respond in the face of scarcity. This led me to the third pillar of the broken system, the toxic morality we assign to food. I had internalized a hierarchy where a kale salad was good and a cookie was bad. Eating the salad made me feel virtuous and clean. Eating the cookie made me feel guilty and ashamed. This good versus bad food paradigm, I realized, was a form of psychological self-flagellation. It turned every meal into a test of my character. The moment I ate a bad food, I had, in my mind, morally compromised myself. This triggered the what the hell effect, a well-documented psychological phenomenon. Since I was already bad, the reasoning went, I might as well be really bad and eat the entire package. The binge was not just a biological correction. It was also a rebellion against the tyrannical judge that lived in my own mind. The food itself was neutral. It was the meaning I had assigned to it that held the power to destroy my peace. As this new knowledge settled within me, a profound shift occurred. The anger and frustration I had directed inward for so long began to turn outward toward the system that had set me up for this cycle of failure. The problem was not my body's response to dieting. The problem was dieting itself. The very premise that sustained extreme restriction is a viable path to well-being was flawed. The cage I now saw with crystalline clarity was not of my own making. I had been born into it, taught to decorate its bars and call it discipline. But now I understood its mechanics. I knew where the weak points were. And for the first time, I felt not like a prisoner, but like an engineer studying the lock, knowing that with the right tools, I could set myself free. The intellectual awakening was complete. The path forward was no longer about finding a better cage, but about learning to live outside of one entirely. Armed with the intellectual understanding that the system was broken, I now faced the most daunting part of the journey, the unlearning. It was one thing to know, in my mind, that willpower was a myth and the restriction binge cycle was biological. It was an entirely different matter to dismantle the deeply ingrained habits, fears, and beliefs that had governed my life for over a decade. This was not a phase of action, but of deconstruction. It was messy, nonlinear, and required a level of patience I did not know I possessed. I was about to learn a new language, the language of my own body, after years of only listening to the shouted commands of external rules. The first and most radical step was to make peace with food. The concept was simple, yet its execution felt like stepping off a cliff. I gave myself unconditional permission to eat all the foods I had previously forbidden. The mental list was long and potent. Pasta, bread, cheese, chocolate, ice cream, chips, pizza. The moment I made this decision, a cacophony of internal voices erupted in panic. My inner critic, the one that had thrived on the diet cycle, screamed that this was a recipe for disaster. You'll lose all control. You'll eat nothing but junk. You'll gain so much weight. The fear was visceral, a tight knot in my stomach. But I committed to the experiment, treating it as a necessary clinical step in my rehabilitation. I went to the grocery store and intentionally bought the forbidden foods. Placing a loaf of crusty sourdough bread in my cart felt like a rebellious act. Buying a box of my favorite cookies was an exercise in leaning into the discomfort. I brought them home and placed them in my pantry and fridge, not as contraband to be hidden, but as neutral items, now legally permitted. The first few days were, as predicted, chaotic. I ate cookies for breakfast. I had a large bowl of pasta for lunch. There was a part of me that did indeed feel out of control, driven by the novelty of permission and the lingering fear that it might be revoked. But I held steady, reminding myself that this was part of the process. The pendulum needed to swing widely before it could find its center. And then, something remarkable began to happen. After about a week, the frenzy started to subside. The chocolate bar, which I had previously devoured in one anxious sitting, now sat in my cupboard, half-eaten for days. The bread was just bread. The ice cream was there if I wanted it. The magic of unconditional permission was that it stripped these foods of their power. They were no longer symbols of rebellion or failure. They were just food. The intense, obsessive cravings that had haunted me for years began to lose their charge and frequency. The mental energy I had spent resisting them was suddenly freed. This was not a descent into gluttony. It was the beginning of normalization. With the external battleground of good and bad foods beginning to quiet, I could now turn my attention inward. I had to rediscover a language my body had been speaking all along, but which I had been trained to ignore, the language of hunger and fullness. I started a practice of mindful check-ins. Before eating, I would pause, place a hand on my stomach, and ask, "Am I physically hungry?" I learned to distinguish the gentle, hollow sensation of true stomach hunger from the tight, anxious craving of emotional hunger, or the dull pull of boredom. I began to eat when I felt the first gentle signals of hunger, not when I was ravenous. I ate slowly, without distraction, paying attention to the taste, texture, and temperature of the food. And I practiced stopping when I was comfortably full, not stuffed. This was incredibly difficult at first. The old voices urged me to clean my plate, or to eat quickly before I could change my mind. But with practice, it became more natural. I learned that satisfaction was not just a physical state, but an emotional one. A small portion of a truly desired food eaten with presence could be far more satisfying than a large, frantic binge eaten in a fog of guilt. This practice of checking in naturally led me to confront the emotional eater within. I began to notice patterns. A difficult work meeting would trigger a desire for something crunchy and salty. A feeling of loneliness in the evening would manifest as a craving for something sweet and creamy. Instead of judging these urges, I got curious. When I felt the pull to eat without physical hunger, I would pause and ask the more profound question: what am I truly hungry for? Sometimes the answer was rest. The craving for sugar was often a mask for sheer exhaustion. In those moments, a 10-minute nap or simply closing my eyes was more effective than a cookie. Sometimes the hunger was for connection. The desire to eat was a way to fill a social void. A phone call to a friend or writing in a journal could soothe that ache. Sometimes the hunger was for stimulation. I was simply bored. A short walk, reading a book, or tackling a small project would dissipate the urge to seek entertainment from food. I was building a new toolkit, one filled with coping mechanisms that addressed the root of the need, not just its superficial expression in a craving. This entire phase was a profound journey inward. I shifted my focus from the external validation of a shrinking number on the scale to the internal barometer of how I felt. I started a simple journal, not for calories, but for sensations. I noted my energy levels, my mental clarity, the quality of my sleep, and my digestive comfort. I began to connect the dots. I noticed that when I ate a balanced breakfast with protein and fat, my mid-morning energy was sustained. I observed that when I ate a large, heavy meal late at night, my sleep was restless. This was not about rules. It was about building a relationship of awareness and respect with my own body. The unlearning was not a destination I arrived at, but a practice I engaged in every day. Some days I was perfectly attuned to my hunger. Other days, I ate out of emotion or simply forgot to check in. The old critical voice would sometimes pipe up, but its power was diminished. I was no longer at war. I was an attentive student, and my body was a wise, if sometimes quiet, teacher. I was learning to trust its signals, to honor its needs, and to see it not as an adversary to be controlled, but as a partner in the complex and beautiful experience of being alive. The cage door was open. I was now tentatively learning how to walk in the wide open space of freedom. With the foundation of peace and self-trust firmly laid, the landscape of my life began to change. The constant internal war had ceased, and in the resulting quiet, I could finally hear the gentle whispers of my own intuition. This phase was no longer about deconstruction, but about construction. It was about building a sustainable, joyful, and nourishing way of living with food. A practice I came to think of as food freedom. This was not a set of new rules disguised as liberation. It was the conscious application of knowledge with self-awareness, a dance between wisdom and desire. The final layer to be integrated was that of gentle nutrition. This was a crucial distinction from where I had started. In the diet world, nutrition is the tyrannical first step, a rigid list of the thou shalt nots that instantly creates rebellion and deprivation. But here, after having made peace with all foods and relearned my body's hunger and fullness signals, nutrition could take its rightful place. It became the last step, a way of honoring my body with knowledge, not controlling it with fear. The central question shifted from the punitive, "Is this food allowed?" to the curious and compassionate, "How will this food make my body feel?" This was not about perfection. It was about intention. I began to play with balance, not as a rigid formula, but as a flexible framework for satisfaction and vitality. I discovered that when I included a source of protein and healthy fat with my meals, I felt satiated for longer, and my energy levels remained stable, without the sharp spikes and crashes I had grown accustomed to. I noticed that adding a variety of colorful vegetables to my plate not only made it more visually appealing, but also left me feeling light and energized. I learned to appreciate the sustained power of complex carbohydrates like oats and sweet potatoes, understanding them not as the enemy, but as the primary fuel for my brain and body. This knowledge, however, never overrode my hard-won permission. Some days, my body truly wanted a vibrant salad brimming with chickpeas, avocado, and a tangy vinaigrette. It felt clean and powerful. Other days, my body and my soul craved the comforting, creamy simplicity of a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup. And both were correct. Both were valid. The salad was not better, and the grilled cheese was not a cheat. They were both responses to a different set of needs on a different day. Gentle nutrition was about adding to my choices, not subtracting from them. It was about inviting more fruits and vegetables to the party because they made me feel good, not because they were bouncers keeping the bad foods out. This philosophy of joyful intention extended powerfully into my relationship with movement. The gym had long been a house of punishment, a place I went to atone for the sins of my eating. I would force myself through routines I despised, counting every rep and every minute with resentment, my only goal being to burn a certain number of calories. It was a transactional relationship, pain for redemption. I quit it all. I canceled my gym membership and gave myself permission to never again do an exercise I hated. Instead, I asked a new, revolutionary question. What kind of movement feels good in my body today? The answers were surprising and diverse. Some days, my body craved stillness and deep stretches, so I would practice yoga on my living room floor, focusing on my breath rather than the burn. Other days, it was a surge of energy, and I would put on my favorite music and dance with abandon, not for a set time, but until the joy began to wane. I started taking long, meandering walks in a nearby park, not to get my steps in, but to feel the sun on my skin, to notice the changing seasons, and to let my mind wander. Movement became about feeling strong, capable, and connected to my physical self. It was no longer a punishment for what I had eaten, but a celebration of what my body could do. Practically, this new approach translated into a kitchen that was both well-stocked and stress-free. I moved away from rigid meal plans and toward a building block mentality. My pantry and fridge were filled with a variety of options, various grains, legumes, lean proteins, healthy fats, and a rainbow of fruits and vegetables. A supportive plate was no longer a prescribed image from a diet book, but an intuitive assembly. It might be a bowl of quinoa with roasted vegetables and a tahini dressing, or it could be a cheesy omelet with a side of toast and avocado. The goal was always the same: satisfaction and nourishment in all its forms. Of course, life continued to happen. There were parties, holidays, stressful deadlines, and days when old triggers resurfaced. The difference was that I now had a toolkit, not a rule book. Before a social event, I would often eat a small balanced snack so I wouldn't arrive ravenous and vulnerable to mindless eating. At the event itself, I gave myself full permission to enjoy any and all foods without a trace of guilt. I would survey the buffet with curiosity, not anxiety, choosing what truly appealed to me. I checked in with my hunger and fullness amidst the laughter and conversation, eating slowly and savoring the experience of connection as much as the food itself. On a difficult day, when the urge to emotionally eat felt strong, I was kinder to myself. I acknowledged the feeling without judgment. Sometimes I would indeed find that a piece of chocolate or a handful of chips provided a genuine moment of comfort. And because I had unconditional permission, I could eat it, enjoy it, and move on without spiraling into a binge. Other times, I would use my new coping skills: a few minutes of deep breathing, a walk around the block, writing down my feelings, and discover that the craving passed. The practice of food freedom was not about being perfect. It was about being present, flexible, and compassionate with myself through all of life's fluctuations. I was no longer following a map drawn by someone else. I was learning to navigate by my own internal compass. The transformation was not marked by a dramatic event or a final triumphant weigh-in. There was no finish line to cross, no certificate to mark my graduation from a state of conflict to one of peace. Instead, the change revealed itself in the quiet, ordinary moments of a life no longer at war. It was in the simple act of walking past a mirror without a critical glance, or in the unthinking ease of ordering from a restaurant menu based solely on what I desired, with no calculation of calories or macronutrients. The liberation was not a destination I reached, but a landscape I had slowly, patiently come to inhabit. The most profound and tangible freedom was the reclamation of mental real estate. I realized one day, with a start, that the constant, draining internal chatter about food, the planning, the negotiating, the obsessing, the self-recrimination, had fallen silent. It was an absence so vast it felt like a presence. The energy that had once been entirely consumed by my struggle with food and my body was suddenly returned to me. This freed-up cognitive bandwidth was staggering. I found myself pouring that energy into my work, experiencing a creativity and focus I hadn't felt since childhood. My relationships deepened because I was truly present with the people I loved, no longer distracted by the private war being waged in my mind. I had the capacity to listen, to engage, to simply be. The exhaustion that had been my constant companion, which I had always attributed to life itself, I now understood was largely the exhaustion of sustaining a perpetual state of self-conflict. My relationship with my body transformed from one of criticism to one of gratitude and respectful coexistence. The scale, that former arbiter of my self-worth, gathered dust in a closet before I eventually threw it away. I stopped scrutinizing my reflection for flaws and started appreciating my body for its functionality and resilience. These legs carried me on long, contemplative walks. These hands could create, comfort, and prepare nourishing meals. This body housed my laughter, my thoughts, and my capacity to love. It was no longer an object to be sculpted and judged, but the instrument through which I experienced the world. I began to care for it, not out of punishment, but out of a genuine desire for it to feel strong and vital. This shift was the cornerstone of a sustainable, gentle form of self-care that had never been possible under the harsh regime of dieting. Food settled into its rightful neutral place in my life, a source of nourishment, pleasure, and connection, but not the central focus of my existence. My diet became intuitively varied and vibrant. I ate vegetables because I enjoyed their freshness and the vitality they imparted. I ate bread because its chewy, comforting substance was a delight. I ate cake at celebrations because it was sweet and joyful. The concept of cheating had evaporated. There was nothing to cheat on. I was simply living, and eating was a natural, integrated part of that living. I listened to my body's cues for what it needed, and I trusted it to guide me. Sometimes that meant a light, plant-based meal. Other times it meant a rich, indulgent dinner. Both were correct, because both were responses to my body's authentic requests. This journey, I must emphasize, is not about arriving at a state of perfect, unbroken harmony. The echoes of diet culture are pervasive in our world, and there are still days when an old, critical thought whispers at the edge of my consciousness. A stressful period might trigger a fleeting desire to seek control through old, restrictive patterns. The difference now is that I have a foundation. The bedrock of self-trust and body respect is strong enough to withstand these tremors. I can acknowledge the thought without following it, recognizing it as a ghost of a past life, not the truth of my present. And so, this is the heart of my story and my invitation to you. If you are tired, truly bone-deep tired of the cycle, if you are exhausted from the endless calculations, the guilt, the shame, and the feeling that you are perpetually failing, consider this a sign. Consider that the answer is not another, better, more perfect diet. The answer is a different path entirely. It is a path of curiosity, not criticism. A path of compassion, not control. A path of returning to the innate wisdom that resides within you. The wisdom that has been waiting patiently beneath the noise of rules and restrictions. Your body is not a problem to be solved. It is not a project to be managed. It is a partner, a faithful companion on this wild and precious journey of life. It holds a deep, quiet knowledge about what it needs to thrive. The constant striving for an external ideal only obscures that inner voice. The freedom you seek is not found in the next meal plan or the next fitness challenge. It is found in the courage to stop the cycle, to lay down your arms, and to finally come home to yourself. It is time to stop the cycle. It is time to listen. It is time to be free. Thank you for sharing this time with me, for listening to my story. If even one part of it resonated with you, I want you to know that a different way is possible. The path to food freedom begins with a single gentle question. What would it feel like to be kind to myself around food today? If this message spoke to you, please let us know in the comments below. Share your own story, your struggles, or your hopes. Let's build a community of support here at Health Storytellers, a place free from judgment, full of empathy. If you found this helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to bringing you more stories and conversations that illuminate the path to genuine, sustainable well-being. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video, where we'll be diving deeper into the practice of intuitive eating. Remember, your health story is still being written. Make it a story of freedom, not fear, of compassion, not control. Until next time, be gentle with yourselves.